Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Richard, welcome back for another round.
It's great to be with you, and again, for another session in the new year of 2016.
Yeah, I thought we would do something that is near and dear to my heart, and I know it's near and dear to your heart as well, and that is, let's have a session on the history of economic thought. Ever since I got into libertarianism and specifically Austrian economics, I've always enjoyed the whole broad survey of how we got where we are today in terms of economic philosophy, the concept of economic liberty. And I know that this is something that you have been delving into ever since you became an economics professor, and maybe even before that. So I thought we would start out with, let's do a broad survey for our viewers of the history of economic thought. What do you think?
I think that's a great topic, and it's an important one. The fact is that economics, as a field, a discipline, a subject area, is a relatively new science. It really only began to take on a systematic form in the 1700s, the 18th century. And this was basically due to the writings and the contributions of two groups of thinkers. One were a group of writers in France, and they became known as the French Physiocrats. The other was in Scotland, in Great Britain, and they were known as the Scottish moral philosophers. Both of them, in their own and slightly different ways, came to a profound and important insight. And that is, there exists the potential for spontaneous order in social and particularly economic affairs that enables the society to function and prosper without government regulation, control, planning, or intervention. Because before that, the presumption is that government had to manage, control, and direct these economic and social affairs of the society. The first uses of the term political economy, for instance, occurred in the early 1600s by a French writer who spoke to the king and the queen of France of that time and said that this is your kingdom, and a wise man must plan and direct his estate, including the people on it. And that is what the purpose of the king was to do, to set the rules, regulations, and controls to direct people to assure their prosperity, and through their prosperity, the wealth, and the strength of the king himself. That got challenged by these two groups of thinkers, the French Physiocrats and the Scottish moral philosophers. Let me first briefly talk about the French Physiocrats. One of the most famous one was a man named Francois Quinet. He actually was a medical physician to the King of France. And his interests, however, turned to social issues. And he wrote what's very famous in the history of economic ideas called the economic table. It's an unbelievably confused, intricate, and difficult graph that he put together in which he attempted to show the interdependency of all the parts of the economy: agriculture, industry, crafts, the church, the monarch, and how they all interdependently assured the prosperity and the satisfying of people's wants. His premise is that you should view the economic body of the society, using his medical analogies, as the parts of the body. There's the heart, there's the lungs, there's the nervous system, there's the stomach, there's the brain. Each of them is participating in a division of labor to assure a balance, a coordination, a well-being of all the parts of the body. Well, he said that you could say the same thing about the parts of an economy. There is a division of labor with agriculture, with industry, with crafts, and so on, and they feed and assist each other through supply and demand, and the price system acting as the incentives for people to do more of things, to do less of things, to satisfy these wants as opposed to those wants. And they argued that this system, this miraculous system of a social body of interdependent parts with a coordinating mechanism of the price system, precluded the necessity for government to plan, direct, or control the affairs of the people. In fact, the people could be left free in their economic affairs, and it would generate more prosperity and well-being than when the king and his officials attempted to manage everything. And they, in fact, were the ones who coined the term laissez-faire. That is, let things pass, let things flow and freely trade, leave alone. Now, the counterpart of these people were known as the Scottish moral philosophers, the leading figures of which, and perhaps some of the listeners and viewers have heard of these names, Adam Smith, the famous not only economist but historian and philosopher, David Hume, a man named Adam Ferguson, who is also a professor of moral philosophy in Scotland. All of these individuals said that society is not planned and directed. What one can discover in looking at the nature and workings of the social order is that it emerges from the bottom up, not from the government planning it from the top down. That individuals interact, and in a proper social setting of institutions, such as private property, individual liberty, rule of law, the social practice of voluntary association and freedom of exchange, there emerges spontaneously and on its own arrangements of division of labor. Adam Smith talks about this in great detail in the early chapters of his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And men discovered that they have talents that their neighbors do not. And if they specialize in something that their neighbors cannot do as well, they can then trade their specialized and better goods for what their neighbors have, which they cannot produce for themselves as effectively or in such a good quality. And therefore, there emerges spontaneously division of labor in society, a specialization of tasks. And as long as relationships are free and voluntary, as if by an invisible hand, to use Smith's own phrase, people discover that the only way they can improve their own circumstances is by applying their talents and abilities and resources to make things that their neighbors want and will take in trade for what their neighbors have that they themselves desire, which they cannot make or not as well as their neighbor can. And this connection of people through the markets and the incentives and guiding role of prices assures a coordination and a prosperity of people's lives better than when the government tries to plan or direct or regulate. In fact, Adam Smith and his other Scottish moral philosopher colleagues came to call this as a system of natural liberty, in which individuals should be free to go about their peaceful and voluntary and self-directed and self-interested affairs in an institutional framework in which the government has only a handful of small and limited functions, and primarily three, Adam Smith says. First, domestic policing and law courts. Policemen to see that domestic bandits and robbers and defrauders do not try to harm us, and a system of law and courts to enforce the laws and to see that there's impartial justice. Then national defense. And national defense is to see that foreign bandits and thieves and attackers do not attempt to invade your country and plunder you from abroad. And finally, Adam Smith did believe in a series of minimal public works. He did believe in government roads, government bridges, dredging a harbor, a minimal amount of government-funded education. Modern classical liberals and libertarians might disagree with whether the government needs to do those functions. But certainly, by today's standards, even those governmental functions other than courts and policing were so limited that it basically, in Adam Smith's ideal world, were meant to leave individuals with virtually absolute unlimited freedom to live their lives as they saw fit, peacefully interacting with their fellow human beings and generating a mutual prosperity that would lift everyone out of poverty and to a very luxurious standard of living, taking the long-run view. And that trade and exchange, and the Physiocrats and the Scottish philosophers argued this, these freedom of exchange and free competition should not be limited to within a country, but the world can benefit. That is, all men everywhere can benefit if we practice a regime of freedom of enterprise at home and freedom of trade among all nations of the world. Because the world is a global community of men who can discover ways through their freedoms to mutually benefit each other's and rise each of them to higher standards of life and quality of living. That was the core in the beginning of modern economics. And it revolutionized the way people saw things and eventually, Jacob, economic policy. Now, Adam Smith died in 1790. And when he died, he was extremely despondent and pessimistic. In his own book, The Wealth of Nations, which had gone through several editions before his death in 1790, he concluded that it was as likely for a regime of free enterprise and free trade to really exist in Great Britain as it would be to hope for a utopia. And he argued this for two reasons, what he called the prejudices of the public and the power of the special interests. The prejudice of the public just means the difficulty of often getting the ordinary man to understand these basic and commonsensical, but sometimes seemingly counterintuitive truths of the market, that when individuals are left free to pursue their self-interest and the profit motive, the society will benefit in that arena of freedom of exchange. And by the power of the interest, he meant the special interests who feed at the trough of government favor, privilege, subsidy, and protection from competition, who would fight tooth and nail to prevent a dismantling of those privileges, favors, subsidies, and protections, because then they would have to openly compete and could be not assured of guarding their wealth in an arena of competition. Well, ideas have consequences, and ideas have power. And I say this because in one person's lifetime, from the time that Adam Smith died in 1790 to the 1840s, there was such a transformation and a revolutionary growth and an understanding and adherence of these free enterprise, limited government, free trade concepts in Great Britain, that in the 1840s, Great Britain unilaterally passed legislation to abolish virtually all of the restrictions on free trade. This was known as the Anti-Corn Law League and the Free Trade Movement. Anti-Corn Law refers to the fact that corn is the British word, the British word for wheat, and it was basically to abolish the anti-freedom agricultural protections. But in the middle of the 1840s, all of these were abolished, and Great Britain had, from then until into the 20th century, a perfect and ideal and truly absolutely limited government free laissez-faire system? No. But along with the United States, who was also practicing these principles on this side of the Atlantic, Great Britain had virtually the closest thing to a truly free market, free trade society. And from that point, Britain prospered, blossomed with enterprise, industrialization, rising standards of living, improvements in the innovations because of the profit mode and guiding entrepreneurs to think of more and better ways to improve how they produced and what they produced and expand their production at lower costs. And on our side of the Atlantic, that was the founding principles of the founding fathers. They revolted against the British. If you read the Declaration of Independence, and not just the famous things about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but their enumerated grievances against the British Crown. What are they complaining about? Well, many things, but among which are crucially taxation that is oppressive and done without their consent, and regulations and controls that are stifling both domestic production and preventing the colonies from freely trading with not only other parts of the British Empire, but the rest of the world. Part of the grievances was the denial of free enterprise and free trade for the American colonists, and that's what they wanted freedom to do. And that became generally, throughout the 19th century, the practice of the new United States. Now, there were waves of protectionism versus free trade in American international economic policy, but in general, as America grew across the continent, it became a vast free enterprise, free trade zone, and usually during that period with a wide degree of free trade between the United States and the rest of the world. And that's how we became the economic giant of both freedom and prosperity that became the envy and the model to emulate by masses of people around the globe. Economic ideas of freedom, and those ideas by those early economists and then their followers in the 19th century liberated mankind from both tyranny and poverty.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to overstate the revolutionary idea that Smith brought up in The Wealth of Nations, and before him, Quinet and the Physiocrats, and Hume and the Scottish philosophers. Because as you point out, prior to that time, throughout history, people were just accustomed to the idea that government should run the economy, that the king should manage the economy, and they expected government to do this. And it was just taken for granted that that's what government does. It runs an economy. And then along come these guys and say, well, no, actually, you're better off if you stop the government from running the economy and you let everybody manage his own economic activity. Well, this was a shocking notion. Now, the most famous figure, I think, even though you mentioned Kenney and Hume, I think the most famous figure for most people is Adam Smith. So he comes up with this monumental treatise, The Wealth of Nations. And it seems to me, Richard, that the major contribution of The Wealth of Nations is that he systematized for the first time the study of economics. I mean, he actually puts this whole thing together, while it was sort of in pieces before that, where he talks about monetary policy and prices and the free market. But it's a very turgid read. It's a difficult read. I would never recommend The Wealth of Nations to anyone unless they have about 5 different commentaries, because he was, if you say, put it this way, looking through a glass darkly in terms of analyzing economic principles. But he got the ball rolling. But there were a lot of bad ideas in there, too. I mean, here were the seeds for the labor theory of value, the cost of production theory of value. And so, you've told us about the great economic boom that took place in Great Britain and the United States following this basic idea of free trade, free enterprise, free markets, the Industrial Revolution, if you will. But let's move into the intellectual sphere of the classical economists, the people that were following Smith, people like David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill and Frederick Bastiat. Tell us about that school of thought.
Well, David Ricardo was a British economist who wrote a famous book called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817, if I remember correctly. He attempted to refine, systemize, and extend Adam Smith's analysis. He's the one who developed, or at least was one of the major developers, and he usually is given credit for it, for the notion of comparative advantage, that even if a one person is better at many things than his neighbors, there are advantages for him to specialize in what he is comparatively or relatively best at, and allow his less productive neighbors to specialize in other things so he can free up his time to do that which he is best at. That's a major important concept in the theory of both domestic and certainly international trade. But what Ricardo did, and I think this is what you're getting at, Jacob, is that Ricardo took a concept in Smith, and that was the labor theory of value. What determines the relative values of goods in the marketplace? Why 3 shirts for a pair of shoes? Why a pair of glasses for 4 cups of coffee? Those relative values of goods in terms of one another. And Smith and others at his time came up with the peculiar notion that while many things go into the production of goods, all goods have one element in their manufacture, and that's labor. You need labor to dig resources out of the ground. You need labor to grow food. You need labor to manufacture goods in a factory. So they said that labor is the common denominator, and therefore what determines the cost of goods is the relative amount of hours, basic labor time, that goes into the manufacture of shoes. So, for example, to use Adam Smith's example from The Wealth of Nations, if it takes a hunter 2 hours to hunt down and kill a deer, and in that same 1 hour of time, a trapper can capture in his traps 2 beaver, then logically 1 deer should trade for two beaver, because that's a comparable amount of labor time to do one activity versus the other. Now, this idea ran through the classical economists of the 19th century. Now, perversely and unfortunately, one of the people who picked up on this idea of the labor theory of value was Karl Marx and other socialists. And what Marx did, and by the way, Marx was not always a communist. I know that sounds strange to believe, but one can find articles written by Karl Marx in the very early 1840s, in which for a Rhineland newspaper, he says communism is not only impracticable as a system, but would be undesirable from the moral point of view. Now that's the Marx I love. Yes, that's the kind of Marxian I could be. Unfortunately, he took a wrong turn. He ended up in Paris. It's a long story. He ended up in Paris, and in Paris, he started interacting with all these French socialists. Marx did not create socialism; it was already in France, and he met he met what the person who became his long-term, lifetime friend and collaborator Frederick Engels, who was also already a socialist, even though he was a capitalist. His father owned textile mills in Germany and Scotland, and Engels ended up running his father's factories in Scotland. So here was an evil exploiting capitalist industrialist who persuades Marx that communism is good. You go figure. Anyway, but Marx came to be influenced by these socialists. That it is private property that is the source of inequality and exploitation. That some have property and others do not. And those who do not must appeal to the property owners to let them work with the property the property's owners own. The way I like to express it, if I can be a little sarcastic here, imagine the little worker coming to the door of the factory, and through the little trap door of the factory entrance, the evil capitalist looks through and says, "Yes." And the little propertyless poor worker says, "Sir, sir, will you let me in and let me work with your machines so I can produce goods, so I can feed my family and myself?" "Well, I'm not a mean person. Yes, come in, use my machines. Now, in a day, you could produce 10 units of output. And you think you have a right to all 10 units, but it's my factory and my machines. And because I'm so good to let you use my machines, out of your 10 units of output, I'm going to keep 3, which is my right, since otherwise you would starve." "Oh, yes, sir, thank you. My children will eat today." Now, for Marx, that's the basis of exploitation. The worker's labor produces 10 units of output. The worker is only allowed in a wage to have 7 units of the output, and the evil capitalist, merely because he owns the factory and the machines, expropriates, takes from that worker 3 units of output that rightly belongs to that worker's efforts. And that is the basis of exploitation. The worker's labor and the value of his labor has been stolen from him. And therefore, how do we assure justice to the workers of the world? The workers of the world must unite. They must rise up and throw off their chains. And they do so through a revolution that expropriates the expropriators. And the means of production are now owned by all the workers in common as a whole. And through that, there will be justice, and the exploiters will be gone. Unfortunately, that labor theory of value and this idea that private property is the source of exploitation and injustice, which Marx then learned also from the socialists in France at that time, that worked in his brain until he then formulated his conception of what he called scientific socialism, where he developed the schema that he understood the laws of history. There was primitive barbarism, then there was primitive slavery, then there was feudalism with the lord of the manor and the little peasants working on the lord's land. That was then replaced by capitalist exploitation, which would finally be overthrown by socialism. And socialism, with the ownership of all the means of production by the workers as a whole, would generate such prosperity that you'd move into the final stage of post-scarcity communism, where from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, because want and worry would now be gone. And that became the rallying cry, and unfortunately the ideological force that came to bring about, in one way or another, in different forms, the demise of laissez-faire, both in Europe and then in the United States.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's somewhat of a logic behind Marx's concept that if you accept the notion that the value of an item is based on how much labor goes into producing it, then there's a logic that says, well, what does the capitalist do? He just sits around. He doesn't do anything. And why should he get any profits at all? Why shouldn't the worker be entitled to the full 100% value of his output? And so it seems to me that once you accept that principle of this labor theory of value, that kind of logically leads to the Marxian principle. I can see why he would argue it. Now, you brought up earlier about the Corn Law League, anti-Corn Law League in Great Britain, and the tremendous success that they had, led by Richard Cobden and John Bright, in bringing free enterprise and free trade to Great Britain. Now, over in France at about the same time, you had Frederick Bastiat that was arguing for the same principles. I find it ironic that Cobden and Bright's writings have really not had the tremendous influence through the ages, and especially the tremendous impact on libertarians that the writings of Bastiat have had. I mean, Bastiat's writings are tremendous. They're just awesome. I would recommend them to everybody, including his famous essay, The Law, and his great petition, The Candlemaker's Petition, the great essay, What is Seen and Unseen. But Bastiat didn't have the same kind of success in France that Cobden and Bright had in Great Britain, right, Richard?
That is absolutely the truth. Bastiat's life history is very interesting. His parents died when he was rather young. He went to live with an uncle in rural France on a farm that the uncle owned. The uncle passed away. He eventually became the owner of it. It was left to him. He really didn't like farming. He became interested in ideas, particularly these laissez-faire free trade ideas, by reading some French thinkers, the Physiocrats, reading the famous French free enterprise advocate Jean-Baptiste Say, and of course those Scottish philosophers. And then he came to be very inspired, as he was becoming familiar with this, by the free trade movement in Great Britain. He read English, and he started absorbing all the English free trade literature. He came to correspond with Richard Cobden. They became friends. But basically, for a long time, Bastiat was doing all of this reading and thinking, sitting on his farm in rural France. Now, he had a neighbor. And this neighbor, of course, the neighbor meant several miles away, and that was when you either walked or rode a horse. So you didn't see your neighbor all the time. So they started writing letters to each other because the neighbor was a socialist. And they exchanged letters for several years in which Bastiat, as he was learning these free trade ideas and trying to formulate his own understanding of them, tried to persuade his neighbor. So in other words, Bastiat was honing his writing skills in the case of free trade by trying to convert his friend and neighbor, which he finally did, by the way. And then, basically, in only the last 10 years of his life, and Bastiat died very early, at about 50 years old, from tuberculosis. In the last 10 years of his life, he has this rush of productivity where all of these essays and little monographs and booklets, and then finally the one real book he wrote called Economic Harmonies, which he finished shortly before his death. He wrote all of these great writings in the last 10 years of his life, like in a flood of ideas that then went on through the pen onto the page. His talent, his ingenuity, is that he not only understood the ideas, but he could explain them with immense clarity, reasonableness, common sense, and with humor and sarcasm in rebutting and challenging and criticizing the arguments of either interventionists and regulators or socialists. Now, many historians of economic thought about the literary talents of Bastiat have always emphasized that no matter how much his biting wit and his sarcasm went after the arguments of his opponents, there was never nastiness, there was never rudeness, there was never impoliteness. It was always an attempt to show the reductio ad absurdum, the logical absurdities in his opponent's arguments, to make them see the stupidity of their own thinking, but never to say that they're stupid, never to say that they are bad people, but they have been guided by illogic and misdirected reasoning to conclusions that are false and counter to the very prosperity and freedom that they say they want to bring to their fellow men. That was the talent of Bastiat. But the tragedy is that while you had all of these great free trade writers and proponents in Great Britain, Richard Cobden and Bright and these economists who finally succeeded in bringing free trade to triumph, as I said earlier, in the mid-1840s, Bastiat in the practice and failed. He went to Paris. He tried to start a newspaper called, in French, Free Trade. He got subscribers, some backers, it failed. He entered the French Parliament. He was a deputy in the French Parliament. Even his critics admired his talent of oration on the floor of the French Parliament. But he could not win there, because in France, unfortunately, the power of the interests and the prejudices of the public, to use Adam Smith's phrases, were too strong. Even with his wit and brilliance of argument, he could not persuade enough French people, and the power of the special interests opposed his proposals to take away their privileges and favors. And so he died without the triumph that people like Cobden and Bright in their lifetime had. But with this different, and you alluded to this, Jacob, nobody really reads the writings of Richard Cobden and John Bright and those other free trade advocates today, unless they're very narrowly an economic scholar of history of ideas. But Frederick Bastiat may have failed in the practical politics of his time, but his ideas have continued to influence generations of people around the world for over a century and a half after his death. That is the power of ideas. You were influenced by Bastiat's ideas. I was. Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. You can go down the list. Walter Williams, all of these people, Thomas Sowell, all of these big names who have advocated economic and personal liberty in the 20th century, that many listeners or viewers at least will have heard these names, maybe read some of them. Every one of them to a man would say that at one point in their life, in their development of their thinking on freedom and economics, Bastiat touched them and influenced how their minds saw the world. And that is far more important in the long-run stream of human events than whether he died as a practical failure in 1850.
Yeah, I'm really glad you point that out, because, you know, sometimes people ask us, well, why are you guys hew to principle so strictly there at the Future of Freedom Foundation? And, you know, nobody's ever guaranteed success in life. I mean, you try the best you can. We're trying to restore free market principles to our land, but nobody says that you're guaranteed success. But you hew to principle because that really, I think, is the only way to achieve success, a truly free market, a free society. But you also have to think in terms of the ages, of the ideas that influence people that come after you. And Bastiat's the perfect example. I mean, sometimes I wonder, what was he thinking as he was dying of tuberculosis? I think by this time he had moved to Italy. He's only 49 years old or so, and I wonder what he's thinking. Oh, my life is such a failure. Or I wonder if people are going to be influenced by my great ideas through the ages, including a couple of guys there in the year 2015. One of the most amazing stories of argumentation and debate that I ever came across was in the life of Bastiat, where he's on a stage debating an opponent. And the opponent is so overwhelmed by the power of Bastiat's arguments that he says, I cannot get up and refute what he has to say, and he just walks away. I mean, it's just powerful. All right, so Bastiat still, though, is taking up the labor theory of value, just like the classical economists, but there are seeds here now for a change, a shift in Bastiat, a shift that's going to take place in the year 1870, a revolution in economic thought, one that's going to undermine the whole labor theory of value, the whole basis of Marxian thought. And we're out of time, unfortunately, but why don't we continue next week with part 2 and talk about the marginal revolution of 1870.
Absolutely. Until then.
Okay, I'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.